All right, so this video is going to be about the civil rights movement. So we've already talked about the Brown v. Board of Education case that desegregated schools. And we also talked about the start of civil disobedience and this movement, okay, including that Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which is going to eventually lead to African Americans in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, refusing to ride the buses as an act of civil disobedience. So at this point, the civil rights movement is also going to have civil disobedience taking place in Birmingham. Now, Birmingham is one of the most violent cities when it comes to race relations and segregation. So Martin Luther King Jr., who is going to rise as the leader of this civil rights movement after that Montgomery bus boycott, is going to lead numerous protests and marches during those 1950s and 60s. And he is going to be arrested for leading a march in Birmingham, Alabama, and he is going to be held in solitary confinement because of it. So in 1963, they're marching, and it's because of all of that violence stemming from those city segregation laws. So we also talked about those Jim Crow laws and what some of those were. So King and 50 others are going to be arrested for violating a ban on protesting, and he's taken to the Birmingham City Jail. So the morning after his arrest, King is going to see a copy of an article that is urging an end to that civil disobedience in Birmingham. So he is going to write what is one of the most important documents of this civil rights movement, and it is this letter from a Birmingham jail. And I want you to make sure that you're familiar with what he says in this letter, because it is one of those required documents for the AP exam. And these are just some pictures from what is happening in Birmingham at this time. So you can see that this woman here is being arrested for protesting. They are being sprayed with a fire hose with protesters, and then the law enforcement is also using dogs against the protesters. So just to give you an idea of what is taking place in that city at this time. All right, so in his letter, King is going to defend his tactics, okay, of civil disobedience on the basis of natural rights and draw a distinction between just and unjust laws. So he's going to talk about why he's in Birmingham, that he's been invited there. He's going to point out that it is a very segregated city. Okay, and then he is going to point out that direct action and nonviolent resistance is sometimes necessary to drive negotiation and make results, okay, to get the government to act. He's also going to talk about how nonviolent action is a good thing, okay? He's going to say it's a middle ground between despair and violence. And he's also going to point out that the actions, he's going to praise the actions of protesters who are refraining from violence despite everything that is happening to them. So he's going to argue that by creating a crisis and confrontation, civil disobedience is forcing white moderates to decide if segregation and oppression is consistent with American values. Okay, so the whole point of this civil disobedience is to get people unnerved, essentially, and to get them to want the government to make changes to end discrimination. All right, so other acts of civil disobedience are going on at this time. Up here you see a picture of a sit-in at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. So Woolworth's is kind of a general store, or what used to be a general store. They don't have them anymore, but they had lunch counters. And in this particular one, because segregation was going on at this time, they would only serve white people at the lunch counter. So 4 African American students are going to go in and sit at the lunch counter, and they just sit there, even though they're not going to get served. So that is an idea of a sit-in. It is peaceful protest. You also had the Freedom Riders, and that's a picture of this down here. So these were people that are going to travel across the country, across the South specifically, on buses, and they're going to challenge segregation laws like separate bathroom facilities for whites and African Americans, separate lunch counters for whites and African Americans. And in one instance in Alabama, the Freedom Riders buses are even going to be bombed. Okay, so these are just examples of that civil disobedience that was happening throughout this civil rights movement. So harsh treatment of these activists by local law enforcement is going to be broadcasted on TV. Okay, so you're going to be able to see things like this bus bombing, and public opinion is going to start to change toward the civil rights struggle. Okay, so more people are going to start to say, hey, there really is a problem here and we need to do something about it. So that is going to put pressure on President Johnson. We know that public opinion can sometimes lead to that, to pass new civil rights legislation. So the first Civil Rights Act that is going to be passed is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this was actually introduced under John F. Kennedy. We know that he was assassinated. So it's going to be Lyndon B. Johnson who's actually going to sign this. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is legislation that outlaws racial segregation in schools and public places. And it authorizes the Attorney General, who's the leader of the Justice Department of the United States, to sue individual school districts that fail to cooperate. So it outlaws discrimination in public accommodations or any place that is open to the public. So things like restaurants, hotels, and theaters. And it's also going to outlaw employment discrimination based on race or ethnicity, religion, national origin, or gender. So it's at this point that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is formed. So they can't discriminate against people in schools or public places, and they also can't discriminate against people in employment. All right, so next we're going to have the March on Selma. And this is an act of civil disobedience that is really going to lead to another piece of legislation that comes out of the civil rights movement. So the March on Selma is going to happen in March of 1965. So with rising racial tensions, civil rights leaders in Alabama are going to plan to take their calls directly to the governor. So they're going to march from Selma to the state capital of Alabama. The governor, George Wallace, is going to order state troopers to use whatever means necessary to stop the march. So you can see the march here, and you can see the state troopers ready to stop them. So the protesters are going to march through downtown Selma, and they're going to begin to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the Alabama River. So you can see the bridge here. They're crossing the bridge. Troopers are waiting for them on the other side. So when they get across, troopers are going to strike protesters. They'll spray tear gas. They chase them on horses. So you can look up other pictures and watch this video here where Representative John Lewis, who is this guy here, he recently passed away, so he served in the House of Representatives, okay? The protesters are not going to fight back to what is happening to them. So you can see where state troopers are attacking the protesters. So TV cameras are going to catch this scene that becomes known as Bloody Sunday, okay? So all of this is happening, and it's going to be on TV. So people are going to be able to see this. So the events in Selma are going to garner support from the public for this next piece of legislation, which is the Voting Rights Act. And I want to point out that this civil rights movement, this is the 50th year anniversary of this March on Selma. So this is President Obama. He was in office at the time. This is Representative John Lewis. This isn't something that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, okay? So these events are still pretty recent, and I want you to keep that in mind. All right, so the March on Selma is going to lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So first, you need to know that the 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964, and that is going to abolish poll taxes, okay? So that requirement to pay a tax in order to vote. So we know that this kept many African Americans from being able to vote because they weren't able to pay that poll tax. Then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it is going to outlaw literacy tests, and it's going to authorize the Justice Department to send federal officers to register voters in uncooperative cities, counties, and states, okay? So this is really going to try to help African Americans really secure that right to vote. And it's also going to eventually lead to an increase in the election of African American legislators in southern states. All right, and that's where we're going to stop with this video.